Hey everyone, in this video we're going to continue with our Web API CRUD and implement our repository and services pattern. Okay, so getting back to our application here, I've added a couple of new folders, repository and services folder. If you remember from last time, we had built out our contacts controller with all of these CRUD methods and then tested it using Swagger UI. So the purpose of the repository and services pattern is to separate out the business logic and data access layers from the controller here. So that's what we're going to be doing here. And I start with the repository, which is going to be for our data access layer. So the first thing I did was to create an interface. I just named it the iRepository interface. And I should say that we are using a generic repository pattern here. So as opposed to having, say iRepository and then type contact, where it could only be used for contacts. It's iRepository T, and we have a type constraint of class. So that's going to be valid for any one of our entities. So when we start, if we were to add, I think if you remember our table, we had a customer table also. So if we were to add a customer's controller, then this would work with that as well as the contacts. So let's just go over these methods real quick. We are doing asynchronous programming here, so they're all going to be tasks. The first one, the list T, that's going to correspond to the first method that we tested the other day was our get contacts method. So that's just going to return all of our entities. And the next one you see here, this get all, I overloaded the method and put this parameter in here. So what this expression func T bool predicate is a predicate method, also known as a delegate. It's just going to allow me to pass a link expression into this method. So now if I want to get all and I want to filter out the results, maybe I want to get all where first name starts with, A or something like that. And then we also have that for our get. So basically all of our query methods are overloaded with this link expression, this delegate or predicate method. And the rest are pretty self-explanatory. So we had a get by ID on our controller. We also had a post, put, and delete. So that's our interface. Next thing, we need to implement our interface. So we need to create a generic repository. What I usually do is create a base class. You don't have to do this, is kind of optional, but I created an abstract base class, which has the same kind of type constraint, type T, and this is where I store my DB context and DB set. And I just have a constructor, and I also implement the iDisposable interface so we can dispose of our DB context. So I should mention that I will be putting all this code on my GitHub, and I'll put a link to that in the description. Okay, so moving along to the actual implementation. So our repository.cs class. So let's go over this. Once again, so it's a repository of type T. So it's going to accept any of our entities, and it's implementing our base class and also our interface. So I have a constructor here, which basically just calls down to my base class. And then I've got all of my CRUD methods here. So if you've worked with DB set and DB context before, you're probably pretty familiar with this. These save changes things, obviously, if we're performing some kind of a command operation, such as put, post, or delete, we're going to have to save changes because we are making changes to the database, and all of our gets are just query operations, so we're not actually having to do any of that. So let's just take a moment and let you take a look at that. And I'll scroll down to the end. Okay, so we have our repository. The next thing we need is, I also created a services folder here. So we need a service layer to go between our controller and this repository. So for that, once again, I created an interface. So this is going to be for our contact entity. So I have a contact service here called iContact Service. And if you take a look at that, these methods, they're very similar to what we saw in our iRepository interface. The only difference, you have task list of contact instead of task list T. And also I got a little more specific with my names, my method names. So we have that. And for the repository, once again, this is optional, but I also created a base class for that where storing, wrong one, services base. So I have a services base class, and this is where I'm injecting my generic repository. So I have my field, and I'm just basically setting that up in the constructor here. Okay, and you could do all of this just in your each service, but I just have a base class, and then I can call this in all of my services. So, and you'll see that right here in the contact service, this constructor just calls down to the base class. I'm inheriting my base class and implementing my iContact service interface. And then these are just all of the methods, all the CRUD methods. If you want to get, let's see, if you want to get fancy with this, you can go over to this, like, looks like a paintbrush or paint roller or something, and click that and go use expression body for methods, and you can make it look all fancy like that. That's just another way of doing this. So this is all of our repository and service stuff that we need. We have one thing left to do, and that is we have to register these. So once again, we go to our program.cs, and this is where we're going to register our dependencies. So I'll probably get into this more in the next video, but essentially there are three different ways that we could do this. We could use something called add transient, which is basically it's going to register a new dependency every single time for, across, even in the same request. It's always going to be new. Or add scoped, which is once per request. And there's something called add singleton, which is going to be the same for all requests. For here, we're going to actually we're going to use add scoped. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy some code in here, and let me just bring in our namespaces. So our repository and our services. Okay, so now I've registered our dependencies. In the next video, we're actually going to test this out using the Swagger UI. And essentially what that's going to involve is going back to our contacts controller and replacing this with our service. And we're going to let that do all the work for us. Hence, that's what we call our unit of work. So I will see you in the next video. And until then, take care.